Rome had just survived Hannibal, but its next enemy was a kingdom built by Alexander's people. This time, Rome was leaving Italy and heading into Greece. Alright, so, Rome had just finished one of the hardest wars it had ever fought. But this time, we are not going back through Hannibal's battles. That story is already behind us. Now something new was happening. Rome was looking across the sea. For years, Rome had been focused on Italy. It had fought the Samnites. It had fought the Greek cities in southern Italy. It had survived Pyrrhus. Then Carthage had forced Rome into a much bigger fight. But after Carthage was beaten, Rome was in a very different position. It was stronger. It had more money. It had more soldiers. And other powers around the Mediterranean had started paying attention. One of those powers was Macedonia. Now, Macedonia was not some small kingdom that Rome could simply ignore. This was the land that had produced Alexander the Great. A few generations earlier, Macedonian armies had marched across Asia and destroyed the huge Persian Empire. Alexander was gone. His empire had broken apart. But Macedonia was still there. And its army was still famous. Its king still ruled from the same part of the Greek world. So when Rome started becoming powerful, Macedonia had every reason to watch closely. And Rome had every reason to do the same. Because here is the thing. The Mediterranean was becoming a crowded neighborhood. There were powerful kingdoms everywhere. Rome had Macedonia in the north, but now a new enemy was rising in the Seleucid Empire farther east, a kingdom richer and more powerful than Rome expected. Egypt to the south, Rome was heading toward Asia, and Rome was now stepping into that world. Could Rome defeat the greatest eastern power yet? At first, Rome did not want to conquer all of the Seleucid Empire, not yet. The war that took the Romans had just spent years fighting for their lives. Watch the full story on Natioryx. They were tired. They had lost huge numbers of men. Another giant war was not exactly what everyone wanted. But history has a funny way of creating problems. And one man was about to bring Rome and Macedonia much closer together. His name was Philip V. Alright, so, Philip V became king of Macedonia in 221 BC. He was young. He was ambitious. And he wanted Macedonia to be powerful again. He had inherited a kingdom with a strong military tradition. Macedonian soldiers were famous for fighting in a huge formation called the phalanx. They stood close together. They carried extremely long spears. And when they moved as one, they could look almost impossible to break. This was not the kind of army you wanted walking toward you. But Philip had a problem. The Greek world was divided. Different cities and states had their own goals. Some wanted Macedonian protection. Others hated Macedonian control. And Philip had to keep all of them under control while also watching other kingdoms. Then Rome entered the picture. And Philip made a decision that would eventually change his entire kingdom. He decided to support Hannibal against Rome. Now, that sounds like a smart move at first. Rome was busy fighting for survival. Hannibal was destroying Roman armies. If Hannibal won, Rome would become much weaker. And if Rome became weaker, Macedonia could have more freedom. But Philip had made one big mistake. He underestimated how hard Rome was to kill. Rome discovered his agreement with Hannibal. The Romans did not want a huge Macedonian army entering the war in Italy. So they came up with another plan. They would keep Philip busy in Greece. And this is where Rome's story in Greece really begins. Alright, so, the First Macedonian War began in 214 BC. But it was not the kind of war where Rome simply landed in Greece with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Rome was already busy fighting Carthage. So the Romans had to be careful. They worked with Greek enemies of Macedonia. They supported groups that wanted to weaken Philip. And they made sure Philip could not give Hannibal the kind of help he wanted. This was clever. Rome did not need to destroy Macedonia. It just needed to stop Macedonia from becoming another major problem. Think about that. Rome was fighting one of the biggest wars in its history. And at the same time, it was making sure another kingdom could not attack it from the east. That was already a sign that Rome was becoming more than an Italian power. But Philip was not easy to deal with. Macedonia had a strong army. They had dealt with Persian kings. But now there was a new power. A power from Italy. And that power was growing fast. The First Macedonian War was over. But the real fight had not even started. Because Philip V was about to make Rome much more interested in Greece. Okay, so, after Rome defeated Carthage in 201 BC, things changed quickly. Rome had more freedom. Its greatest enemy was gone. And now the Romans could look around. What did they see? Macedonia. Philip was still there. And he was still expanding his influence. Some Greek states were scared. Pergamon was worried. Rhodes was worried. And Rome was being asked to step in. At first, Rome was not eager to start another huge war. The Roman people remembered Hannibal. They remembered the years of fighting. They knew what war could cost. So the Roman leaders had to convince the people that Macedonia was a real threat. That took time. But eventually, Rome declared war. This became the Second Macedonian War. And this one was very different from the first. Rome was no longer distracted by Hannibal. Now Rome could focus. Its army could cross into Greece. Its leaders could plan a longer campaign. And Rome had allies. That was a huge advantage. Because Philip was not fighting one enemy. He was fighting a growing group of enemies who wanted his power reduced. Rome did not have to conquer Greece by itself. It could let Greek states help. It could use local knowledge. It could use local soldiers. And it could make Philip look more isolated with every victory. That was one of Rome's favorite ways to fight. Turn your enemies' neighbors into your friends. Philip knew the danger. He had a strong army. But he was surrounded by problems. And then came the battle that changed everything. Cynocephaly. Look, if you want to understand why Rome became so powerful, pay attention to this battle. Because at Cynocephaly, two very different military systems came face to face. On one side was Macedonia. Its greatest weapon was the phalanx. Picture thousands of soldiers standing close together. Their shields were close. Their long spears pointed forward. Everyone moved together. When the ground was flat and the formation stayed organized, it could be terrifying. This style of fighting had a huge history behind it. Philip's ancestors had used it. Alexander had used it. Macedonian armies had used it to conquer enormous parts of the ancient world. So Philip trusted it. And honestly, he had every reason to. But Rome had a different kind of army. Roman soldiers could fight in smaller groups. They could move around. They could react to changes. They were not tied together in one giant block in the same way. That made them more flexible. And the battlefield at Cynocephaly was not perfectly flat. There were hills. There was rough ground. And that was a problem for the Macedonian formation. Alright, so, in 197 BC, the two armies met. At first, things were not simple. The Macedonian phalanx could still push hard. Some parts of the Roman army were struggling. Philip had reason to believe he could win. But then the terrain began causing problems. Parts of the Macedonian line became separated. The formation was no longer moving as one. And when that happened, the Romans saw their chance. Roman soldiers moved into the gaps. They attacked from different directions. The long Macedonian spears were much harder to use when Roman soldiers were already close. The phalanx began to lose its strength. And once the formation started breaking apart, the battle turned against Philip. The Romans won. Philip's army had been defeated. And Rome had just beaten one of the most famous military systems in the Greek world. That was a big deal. The old Macedonian military machine had met something it could not easily handle. Philip now had to make peace. But Rome had a very interesting decision to make. Would it keep Greece? Would it conquer Macedonia? Would it turn the whole region into Roman territory? The Romans chose something different. At least for now. They said the Greek states would be free. And that announcement became one of the most famous moments of Rome's early involvement in Greece. Okay, so, in 196 BC, Roman commander Titus Quinctius Flamininus made a public announcement at the Isthmian Games. He declared that the Greek states were free. No more Macedonian control. No forced payments to Macedonia. No Macedonian armies controlling them. The crowd went wild. Imagine being there. You have spent years living in a world where Macedonia is one of the strongest powers around you. Then a Roman commander stands up and says, "You are free." It must have felt incredible. But there was something else going on. Rome was saying Greece was free. Yet Rome had just defeated Macedonia. Rome had powerful allies. And Rome had become the strongest outside. So was Greece really free? Well, technically, yes. But Rome now had a huge amount of influence. And influence can be almost as powerful as direct control. The Romans did not need to place a Roman governor in every Greek city. They could simply decide who was allowed to become powerful. They could support one side. They could threaten another. They could send an army when they needed to. And everyone knew it. That is why this moment is so important. Rome had learned how to rule without always directly ruling. And that would become very important later. But Philip was not the only king watching. Farther east, another ruler was paying close attention. His name was Antiochus III. And his kingdom was enormous. Alright, so, Antiochus III ruled the Seleucid Empire. This was one of the largest kingdoms left from the world created after Alexander the Great. It covered huge areas across the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia. Antiochus was not weak. In fact, he had spent years rebuilding his power. He had armies. He had money. He had cities. He had a long military tradition. And now he was looking toward Greece. Rome was already there. That was a problem. Some Greek leaders asked Antiochus for help. Others supported Rome. The situation became more tense. And then someone very familiar entered the story. Hannibal. Yes. The same Hannibal who had once crossed the Alps. After Carthage lost the war, Hannibal remained active in Carthaginian politics. Rome did not trust him. Eventually, he left Carthage. And he found shelter with Antiochus. Now think about how strange this was. Rome had spent years trying to defeat Hannibal. Now Hannibal was standing beside a powerful eastern king. And he was warning him about Rome. Hannibal understood Rome better than almost anyone. He knew what Rome could survive. He knew how Rome fought. And he knew that Rome was not a power you should take lightly. But Antiochus did not fully follow Hannibal's advice. He entered the conflict. And Rome was ready. The Roman-Syrian War began. Rome crossed into Greece again. Antiochus had a strong army. He also had war elephants. He had cavalry. He had Greek allies. But Rome had already learned how to fight armies like this. At Thermopylae, the Romans defeated Antiochus in 191 BC. Antiochus was forced to retreat. But the war was not over. The fighting moved into Asia Minor. And then came Magnesia. Look, Magnesia was another huge moment. Antiochus had a large army. He had plenty of different troops. He had cavalry. He had elephants. He had soldiers from different parts of his empire. But Rome had something very important. Experience. The Romans had now fought Macedonians. They had fought Greek armies. They had fought Carthaginians. They had fought elephants. They had learned how different armies worked. And that made them dangerous. At Magnesia in 190 BC, Roman forces defeated Antiochus. He was forced to accept peace. His power in the western part of his empire was reduced. Rome had now pushed a major eastern king back. And this changed the balance of power. Rome was no longer just influencing Greece. It was influencing Asia Minor too. Think about how crazy that is. A city in Italy had become powerful enough. Rome was expanding without even needing to conquer every place it defeated. And there was a reason. Rome had learned that controlling the balance of power could be enough. But Macedonia was still there. Philip V was gone from the main story. His son Perseus would take over. And Perseus had watched everything. He had seen Rome defeat his father. He had seen Rome defeat Antiochus. He knew Rome was dangerous. But he also believed Macedonia could rise again. And that belief would bring Rome back. Alright, so, Perseus became king of Macedonia in 179 BC. He wanted to restore Macedonian strength. He worked to improve the army. He tried to build support among the Greek states. And for a while, Macedonia started looking powerful again. That made Rome nervous. Very nervous. The Romans did not want Macedonia becoming strong enough to challenge them. They had already fought Philip. They had already defeated Antiochus. They had already become the strongest outside power in Greece. They did not want another major kingdom rising right next to their new sphere of influence. So Rome watched Perseus closely. Every move mattered. Every alliance mattered. Every military action mattered. And eventually, Rome decided that Macedonia had gone too far. In 171 BC, the Third Macedonian War began. But this war did not go exactly how Rome wanted. Perseus was a capable ruler. His army could still fight. The Macedonian phalanx was still dangerous. Rome had trouble getting a quick victory. The war dragged on. And this is important. Because Rome was not some magical machine that won every war instantly. Sometimes Rome struggled. Sometimes its generals made mistakes. Sometimes its enemies fought very well. But Rome had one advantage that kept showing up. It could keep coming. Then a Roman commander named Lucius Aemilius Paulus took control. And the war was about to reach its final battle. Pydna. Okay, so, in 168 BC, Roman and Macedonian forces met at Pydna. This was the moment everything came down to. The Macedonian army still had its famous phalanx. The Romans knew what they were facing. But they also knew something else. The phalanx was strongest when it stayed together. If it became broken up, it became much weaker. And once again, the battlefield mattered. The ground was not perfectly flat. The Macedonian soldiers had to move across uneven ground. Small gaps started appearing. And Roman soldiers moved into those gaps. Suddenly, the Macedonian long spears were not enough. Roman soldiers were fighting at close range. The phalanx could not turn easily. Parts of the formation became separated. And once that happened, the Roman soldiers attacked hard. The Macedonian army collapsed. Perseus was defeated. And this time, Macedonia would not simply make peace and return to normal. Macedonia's great power was finished. Perseus was taken prisoner. The kingdom was broken into separate areas. Its political power was crushed. And Rome had made its message very clear. No Greek kingdom was going to become strong enough to challenge Rome. But Rome's victory had another effect. Rome had entered Greece claiming to defend freedom. Now Rome was deciding what happened to Greek kingdoms. And that created anger. Some Greek states started resisting. The Romans responded. And eventually, another major conflict came. The Achaean League challenged Rome. The Romans won. And in 146 BC, Corinth was destroyed. That same year, another famous Roman victory happened far to the west. Carthage was destroyed too. So 146 BC was a massive year for Roman power. Carthage was gone. Corinth was gone. Macedonia was finished. Greece was now under Roman control. And Rome had become the strongest power in the Mediterranean. The world had changed. Look, this is the part where you can really see how far Rome had traveled. At the beginning, Rome was an Italian city. It fought nearby tribes. It fought other Italian kingdoms. It fought Greek cities in southern Italy. Then it fought Carthage. Then Hannibal came. Rome survived. And instead of becoming weaker after that war, Rome became stronger. Then Rome looked east. Macedonia became the next major challenge. Rome defeated Philip. Then Antiochus challenged Rome. Rome defeated him too. Then Perseus rebuilt Macedonian power. Rome returned. And Macedonia fell. This was not one giant plan written down from the beginning. It was a chain of wars. One problem led to another. One victory created another opportunity. And every time Rome won, it gained more influence. More allies. More money. More military experience. And more confidence. That is the part that made Rome so dangerous. Victory kept making the next victory easier. But there is another side to this story. Rome conquered Greece. Yet Greece changed Rome too. Greek culture was already incredibly old. Greek writers had been creating books for centuries. Greek thinkers had studied nature, politics, math, and philosophy. Greek artists had created famous styles. And Roman elites were fascinated by all of it. After Rome took control of Greece, Greek culture became even more important in Roman life. Roman families hired Greek teachers. Roman writers studied Greek works. Greek art was brought to Rome. Greek ideas became part of Roman education. So Rome won the war. But Greece had a huge influence on Rome. That is one of the strangest parts of ancient history. Rome conquered Greece, but Greece helped shape Rome. And that influence would last for centuries. Rome's expansion changed the Roman winning wars brought enormous wealth into Rome. Soldiers came home with experience. Generals became famous. Rich families gained more land. Huge numbers of enslaved people were brought into Roman territory. The gap between rich and poor became more serious. Political fights became harder. The Roman Republic was becoming more powerful than ever. But it was also becoming more unstable. The same wars that made Rome great were creating problems inside Rome. And those problems would eventually become very serious. But that was still years away. For now, Rome had won. Macedonia had fallen. Greece was under Roman control. And Rome had crossed the biggest line of all. It was no longer just an Italian power. It was a Mediterranean power. And that changed everything. Okay, so, if you only look at the battles, you might think this story is simple. Rome had a better army. Rome beat Macedonia. End of story. But honestly, it was much bigger than that. Rome won because it had a system that was hard to break. It could raise armies. It could replace soldiers. It could make alliances. It could fight for years. And when a plan failed, Rome could try another one. Macedonia had a strong army. But it did not have the same huge network of allies and manpower that Rome could draw from. And that difference mattered. The Macedonian phalanx was powerful. But it had weaknesses. The Roman army could adapt. That became very clear at Cynocephaly and Pydna. The Greek kingdoms were powerful. But they were divided. Rome used those divisions. And once Rome had defeated the strongest kingdoms, it became much harder for anyone else to stop it. That was the real Roman advantage. Rome did not need to be stronger everywhere. It only needed to be strong enough at the right moment. And Rome was very good at that. So when you look at Rome's rise from Italy into Greece, the story is not just about armies. It is about timing. It is about alliances. It is about patience. And it is about knowing when to step into someone else's fight. That was Rome's real game. And Rome was getting very good at it. Real talk, this is where the title of our story really matters. From Italy to Greece. Rome had started in Italy. That was its home. But after centuries of fighting, Rome had become something much bigger. The wars with Macedonia were a major step in that change. Rome crossed the Adriatic. It fought Greek armies. It defeated Macedonian kings. It pushed back the Seleucid Empire. It took control of Greece. And after 146 BC, there was no question anymore. Rome was one of the greatest powers in the Mediterranean. But Rome was still hungry. There were more lands. More kingdoms. More rivals. And more problems. Egypt would eventually come into Rome's story. Asia would come into Rome's story. North Africa would remain important. And Rome's own politics would become more dangerous than any foreign enemy. Because the biggest threat to the Roman Republic would eventually come from inside. The generals who became heroes in foreign wars would start fighting each other. Powerful Roman families would fight for control. The Senate would become more divided. And one name would eventually rise above all the others. Julius Caesar. But Caesar was not here yet. Before him, Rome had to finish building the world he would inherit. And Macedonia was a huge part of that story. Because when Rome defeated Macedonia, it did not simply win another war. It stepped into the Greek world. It stepped into the Eastern Mediterranean. And it began a new chapter. The little city that had once fought for survival in Italy was now deciding the future of kingdoms thousands of miles away. Pretty wild, right? So if you ask what happened when Rome met Macedonia, the answer is bigger than just one winner. Macedonia lost its power. Greece lost its independence. Rome gained the Mediterranean. And Rome's journey was only getting started. The next enemies would be different. The next wars would be even bigger. And eventually, Rome would stop fighting just to expand. It would begin fighting over who should control Rome itself. That is when the Roman Republic starts to crack. And honestly, that story might be even crazier. Rome had conquered Greece, but now a new enemy was rising in the east. A kingdom richer and more powerful than Rome expected. And this time, Rome was heading toward Asia. Could Rome defeat the greatest Eastern power yet? Rome versus the Seleucid Empire. The war that took Rome into Asia. Watch the full story on Natioryx.